In the early months of World War II in the Pacific, Japanese fighter pilots believed they had mastered the sky. Their aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0, ruled the air with legendary agility. Lightweight, deadly, and piloted by men trained in ruthless precision, the Zero had already humiliated Allied pilots across the Pacific. Against it, many American planes felt slow, fragile, and outdated. So when U.S. intelligence reports began mentioning a new American fighter, the F4U Corsair, Japanese pilots laughed. At first glance, the Corsair looked like a mistake. Its massive propeller demanded an awkward, bent-wing design that made the aircraft look ungainly in the air. Worse still, early test pilots called it dangerous. Carrier landings were brutal. The long nose blocked forward visibility. Bounces on the deck caused crashes. American pilots nicknamed it the Widowmaker. The Japanese had no reason to fear it. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't yet see, was what lived inside that strange blue aircraft. The F4U Corsair was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. It gave the Corsair raw speed, over 400 miles per hour, faster than the Zero at most altitudes. And mounted in its wings were 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, capable of throwing a wall of lead that no lightly armored Japanese aircraft could survive. Still, early encounters were rare. The U.S. Navy hesitated to deploy the Corsair from carriers. Instead, the plane was sent to land bases in the Solomon Islands, where Marine Corps pilots began training far from the eyes of the enemy. That would soon change. By mid-1943, the Pacific Air War was shifting. American industry was flooding the skies with new machines, and pilots were learning, sometimes the hard way, how to fight smarter, not tighter. The Zero could turn faster, yes, but it couldn't dive as fast, it couldn't absorb damage, and it couldn't escape once a Corsair lined up its guns. Japanese pilots were about to learn a brutal lesson. The laughter would stop. Because when the Corsair finally met the Zero in real combat, those 6 .50 caliber guns didn't just fire, they shredded. The first true test of the F4U Corsair came not from a grand carrier battle, but from the humid, unforgiving air above the Solomon Islands. By early 1943, Marine fighter squadrons were operating from rough coral airstrips carved out of jungle terrain. These pilots weren't chasing glory, they were trying to survive. On one such morning, radar operators detected incoming Japanese aircraft approaching American positions, a familiar threat. Zeros, confident, aggressive, and deadly. The order was given, and a handful of Corsairs roared down the runway, their massive engines shaking the ground as they lifted into the sky. Japanese pilots spotted the newcomers almost immediately and dismissed them just as fast. The Corsair was bigger, heavier, less elegant. To Zero pilots trained in tight, swirling dogfights, it looked like an easy target. One Japanese ace reportedly banked hard toward the American formation, expecting the usual outcome: outturn, close in, kill. But the Corsair pilot didn't turn. Instead, he pushed the nose down. The Corsair dove like a falling hammer, its speed climbing rapidly. The Zero tried to follow, but couldn't. The Japanese aircraft began to shake under the stress, forcing its pilot to pull up. That was the mistake. The Corsair climbed back with terrifying momentum, lining up behind the Zero in seconds. The Marine pilot squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns erupted at once. The effect was instant and catastrophic. The Zero's thin aluminum skin offered no protection. Bullets ripped through the fuselage, shredded control cables, and ignited fuel vapors. Witnesses later described the aircraft coming apart in mid-air, panels flying, smoke pouring, fire trailing behind as it spiraled toward the jungle below.
The engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. For the first time, Japanese pilots realized something was very wrong. The Corsair hadn't fought the Zero's battle. It refused the turn fight. It attacked from above, struck with overwhelming firepower, and escaped before retaliation was possible. This wasn't a duel, it was an execution. More encounters followed in the days ahead. Each time, the pattern repeated. Zeros tried to lure Corsairs into turning contests. Corsair pilots ignored them. They used speed, altitude, and discipline, diving attacks, high-speed passes, and brutal firepower. Losses mounted. Japanese radio chatter grew frantic. Reports described a new American fighter that could not be caught and could not be shaken once it attacked. Pilots warned each other, do not pursue in a dive, do not engage alone. But warnings don't stop bullets, and the Corsair was just getting started.
To understand why the F4U Corsair was so deadly against the Mitsubishi Zero, you have to understand how different the two aircraft truly were. On paper, the Zero looked unbeatable. It could outturn almost any Allied fighter. It climbed quickly, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, it was terrifyingly precise. But the Zero was built on a fatal compromise. To achieve its legendary agility, Japanese engineers stripped the aircraft of protection. There was no armor plating for the pilot. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Even a few well-placed bullets could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Against lightly armed opponents early in the war, this gamble worked. Against the Corsair, it was suicide. The F4U Corsair was the opposite. It was heavy, overbuilt, and brutally powerful. The massive double-wasp engine gave it speed the Zero simply could not match in a dive or in level flight at altitude. More importantly, the Corsair could absorb punishment. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the chance of catastrophic fires. Even if hit, the aircraft could often make it home. American pilots were trained to exploit these differences. They used a tactic called a boom and zoom. Corsairs climbed high above Japanese formations, waited patiently, then dove at extreme speed. The attack was fast, violent, and usually fatal. After firing, the Corsair used its speed to climb back to safety before the Zeros could respond. Japanese pilots tried to adapt. Some attempted head-on passes, hoping to score a lucky hit, but this only made things worse. 6 synchronized 50-caliber guns, firing hundreds of rounds per minute, created a wall of lead no Zero could survive. In head-on attacks, the Japanese pilots often died before they could fire. Others tried teamwork, luring Corsairs down while wingmen waited above. But the Corsair's raw power allowed it to climb away from danger far faster than expected. The trap rarely worked. Perhaps most devastating was the psychological effect. Japanese pilots had grown used to dominance. Suddenly, they were facing an aircraft that ignored their strengths and punished their weaknesses mercilessly. Veterans began warning younger pilots to avoid the Corsair at all costs. Some even claimed it was more dangerous than the P-38 Lightning. By late 1943, combat reports were undeniable. When flown correctly, the Corsair did not merely compete with the Zero, it dominated it. And as more squadrons arrived in the Pacific, the balance of power in the sky began to tilt hard.
The F4U Corsair was not an easy aircraft to fly. Power like that came with a price. Torque from the massive engine could twist the aircraft violently during takeoff. Landings were dangerous, especially on short, uneven island airstrips. Many young pilots learned quickly that the Corsair demanded respect, or it would kill them before the enemy ever could. But the U.S. Marine Corps was patient. Marine pilots trained relentlessly, flying the Corsair until its behavior became instinct. They learned how to manage its power, how to see past the long nose during landings, and, most importantly, how to fight the Zero on their own terms. These were not reckless dogfighters, they were disciplined hunters. One of the first squadrons to truly master the Corsair was VMF 124, deployed to Guadalcanal. Their aircraft, painted in deep navy blue, became a terrifying sight for Japanese pilots. The Marines developed strict rules: never turn with a zero, never chase into low-altitude traps, and never break formation without cover. The results were immediate. Corsair pilots began racking up kills at a staggering rate. Japanese formations that once roamed freely now hesitated, climbing higher and approaching more cautiously. When Corsairs appeared, Zeros often broke off entirely, refusing combat. Marine aces emerged quickly. Pilots like Gregory B. Pappy Boyington became legends. Flying the Corsair, Boyington exploited its speed and firepower to devastating effect. He didn't outturn his enemies, he outthought them. Attack, fire, disengage, over and over. Each mission left fewer zeros in the sky. The Corsair also changed morale. For the first time in the Pacific War, American pilots felt they had an aircraft that gave them a clear advantage. Confidence replaced desperation. Losses dropped, victories climbed. The Corsair became more than a fighter, it became a symbol that the tide of the war was turning. Japanese intelligence took notice. Reports warned of a new blue fighter that could not be caught and rarely missed. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged engagements. But by now, Japan was running out of experienced airmen. New pilots lacked the training to survive against a machine as unforgiving as the Corsair, and the skies grew deadlier by the day. Once Japanese pilots understood they could no longer dominate the Corsair in a turning fight, they tried something else. They tried to escape. Early in the war, the Zero had been able to disengage from most Allied fighters with ease. If a fight went poorly, a Japanese pilot could dive away, trusting the aircraft's light frame and responsive controls to carry him to safety. Against the Corsair, that instinct proved fatal. The F4U was faster, much faster. When a Zero broke away and pushed its nose down, the Corsair followed, gaining speed rapidly as gravity and raw engine power worked together. The gap closed in seconds. And once the Corsair was behind a fleeing Zero, there was nowhere to hide. Marine pilots learned to wait. They held their fire until they were close enough to see rivets tear free under impact. Then they squeezed the trigger, unleashing a short, controlled burst. The 650 caliber guns hammered the Zero's wings and fuselage, ripping through fuel tanks and control surfaces. Often the Japanese aircraft didn't explode, it simply disintegrated. Zeros began shedding parts mid-dive. Wings folded, engines tore loose, pilots blacked out under forces their aircraft could not withstand. Japanese commanders issued new instructions: do not dive away from Corsairs. So pilots tried climbing instead. That failed too. The Corsair's engine gave it superior climb performance at most combat altitudes. A Zero pulling into a steep climb bled speed quickly. The Corsair followed, guns steady, and finished the fight with brutal efficiency. Even coordinated escapes failed. Japanese formations attempted split maneuvers, some climbing, others diving, hoping to confuse attackers. Corsair pilots simply picked one target and destroyed it before repositioning. Their aircraft retained energy far better, allowing repeated attacks in a single engagement. The psychological toll was devastating. Surviving Japanese pilots reported feeling hunted. The Corsair did not chase blindly. It stalked, struck, and vanished. Air battles that once felt chaotic now felt one-sided. Confidence drained away.
By late 1943, Zero pilots were ordered to avoid Corsairs entirely unless they had overwhelming numerical advantage. But the American buildup in the Pacific made that increasingly rare. And worse still for Japan, the Corsair was no longer alone. More advanced Allied fighters were arriving. Radar coordination improved. Japanese airfields came under constant attack. The Corsair had broken the myth of zero invincibility, and the reckoning was far from over. For all its success in land-based combat, the F4U Corsair still carried a reputation that worried U.S. Navy commanders. Early carrier trials had been disastrous. The aircraft's long nose blocked visibility during landing approaches. Its stiff landing gear caused violent bounces. Several pilots were killed in training accidents, and the Navy quietly sidelined the Corsair from carrier operations. But war does not wait for perfection. By 1944, the demand for high-performance fighters was overwhelming. Engineers modified the Corsair, improving landing gear, adjusting cockpit visibility, and refining carrier procedures. Pilots trained relentlessly, learning exact approach speeds and descent angles. Slowly, the Corsair earned a second chance. That chance came aboard U.S. Navy carriers in the Pacific. When the Corsair finally returned to the deck, it did so as a matured weapon. Pilots who had survived land-based combat brought experience and discipline. Carrier landings were still dangerous, but manageable. And once airborne, the Corsair delivered exactly what the fleet needed. It could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. It could intercept Japanese raids before they reached the fleet. And it could destroy enemy aircraft with terrifying efficiency. Japanese pilots who encountered Corsairs over the open ocean were shocked. There were no mountains to hide behind, no jungle to dive into. Once engaged, escape options vanished. The Corsair's speed allowed it to control the fight completely. One Japanese pilot later described the experience as being chased by something that never tired. The Corsair also proved devastating in ground attack roles. Its heavy construction allowed it to absorb flak while strafing airfields, shipping, and troop concentrations. The same 6.50 caliber guns that shredded Zeros tore apart trucks, fuel depots, and parked aircraft. Carrier groups quickly learned to trust the Corsair. By late 1944, it was flying from nearly every major fleet in the Pacific. What had once been called the Widowmaker was now one of the safest and most respected fighters in the American arsenal. And as the war moved closer to Japan itself, Corsair pilots would face their deadliest challenge yet: a new kind of enemy attack. By late 1944, the air war over the Pacific entered its darkest phase. Japan, running out of aircraft, fuel, and experienced pilots, turned to a desperate tactic: kamikaze attacks. These were not dogfights, they were suicide missions aimed directly at American ships. For U.S. carrier groups, the threat was terrifying. Kamikaze pilots flew straight through anti-aircraft fire, ignoring damage, focused only on slamming their aircraft into flight decks and hulls. Even a single hit could cripple a carrier. Stopping them required speed, firepower, and ruthless efficiency. This was where the Corsair excelled. Flying combat air patrol high above the fleet, Corsair pilots scanned the horizon for incoming threats. When radar picked up enemy aircraft, Corsairs were often the first fighters vectored in. Their speed allowed them to intercept kamikazes far from the ships, sometimes minutes before impact. There was no maneuvering, no hesitation. Corsair pilots attacked head-on or from above, firing long bursts that tore kamikaze aircraft apart. The 6.50 caliber guns proved devastating. Many kamikazes disintegrated before their pilots even realized they were under attack. But these missions were among the most dangerous of the war. Kamikaze pilots did not break away. They did not dodge. Even when hit, some aircraft kept flying, trailing smoke and fire, still aimed at American ships. Corsair pilots were often forced to fire until the last possible second, sometimes passing through explosions and debris. In several documented cases, Corsairs physically rammed kamikaze aircraft after their guns jammed or ammunition ran out. Pilots made split-second decisions, knowing that failure meant the loss of hundreds of sailors below. Losses were inevitable. Some Corsairs were hit by defensive fire or debris. Others ran out of fuel after extended intercepts. But the alternative, letting kamikazes through, was unthinkable. Japanese pilots quickly learned to fear the Corsair silhouette. Its deep engine roar became a warning that death was approaching fast. Kamikaze formations that encountered Corsairs early were often wiped out completely. By the time of the battles for Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, the Corsair had become one of the fleet's most reliable defenders. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a shield. And as the war reached Japan's doorstep, the Corsair's legend was nearly complete.
As 1944 turned into 1945, Japanese air commanders faced a grim reality. The numbers no longer lied. Whenever the F4U Corsair appeared in combat reports, Japanese losses spiked dramatically. Squadrons were being erased in days, sometimes hours. The kill ratios were staggering. In several Pacific campaigns, Corsair units achieved ratios exceeding 10-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. In some engagements, the numbers were even worse. Entire Japanese formations were destroyed without a single Corsair loss. For an air force already bleeding experienced pilots, these losses were catastrophic. The reasons were clear. Corsair pilots were now veterans. Many had dozens of combat missions behind them. They flew with discipline, patience, and coordination. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were increasingly young and undertrained, rushed into combat with minimal flight hours and little understanding of modern air combat tactics. The aircraft themselves made the imbalance even worse. Zeros still lacked armor, still lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, still relied on turning ability that no longer mattered against opponents who refused to play that game. A single Corsair burst was often enough to destroy them completely. Japanese intelligence officers reported with alarm that Corsairs could absorb damage that would have killed a Zero instantly. Pilots complained that even successful hits often failed to bring the American fighters down. Morale suffered badly. Some Japanese pilots attempted new tactics, night attacks, low-level approaches, mass formations, but Corsair units adapted quickly. Radar control improved, team tactics tightened, the margin for survival vanished. One captured Japanese pilot reportedly stated that facing the Corsair felt like fighting a machine that could not be stopped. By early 1945, American pilots openly preferred the Corsair for the most dangerous missions. Its combination of speed, durability, and firepower inspired confidence unmatched by earlier fighters. The aircraft's reputation spread fast. Japanese pilots began identifying Corsairs visually at long range and breaking off before contact. Some refused engagement orders altogether, knowing the odds were hopeless. The laughter from 1943 was long gone. Now there was only fear. And as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, the Corsair would take on one final role, one that would seal its place in history. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a point no one had imagined just 3 years earlier. American aircraft were now operating within striking distance of Japan's home islands. The skies that had once been dominated by the Zero were no longer safe. Corsairs were among the fighters leading the way. Flying from carriers and captured island airfields, Corsair pilots escorted bombers deep into enemy territory. They attacked airfields, factories, rail lines, and ports. Every mission pushed Japanese defenses closer to collapse. But these flights were among the most dangerous of the war. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was thick and deadly. Remaining fighter units, though badly depleted, fought with desperation. Some pilots attacked head-on, knowing they might not return. Others flew obsolete aircraft loaded with bombs, hoping for one last successful strike. The Corsair met them all with brutal efficiency. American pilots used altitude and coordination to their advantage. When Japanese fighters attempted to intercept bomber formations, Corsairs dove in, scattering them before they could organize. 6.50 caliber guns filled the sky with fire, tearing apart attackers in seconds. Ground attack missions were even more punishing. Corsairs strafed airfields moments before takeoff, destroying aircraft on the ground and killing pilots before they ever reached the cockpit. Fuel dumps burned for hours. Runways were cratered beyond use. Japan's ability to defend its own airspace shrank with each passing week. For Japanese civilians, the sound of Corsair engines became a signal to run for cover. For Japanese pilots, it was a reminder of how completely the balance of power had shifted. Many Corsair pilots later described these missions as emotionally heavy. The enemy was clearly beaten, yet still fighting. Every flight carried the risk of flak, mechanical failure, or a final suicidal attack. Still, the missions continued. Because air superiority was no longer a goal, it was a requirement. And the Corsair delivered it relentlessly, day after day, until Japan's skies belonged to the Allies alone. At the heart of the Corsair's legend was a simple, terrifying truth. Its guns worked every time. While tactics and training mattered, it was the raw, unforgiving power of 650 caliber Browning machine guns that turned encounters with the Zero into one-sided slaughters. Each gun fired hundreds of rounds per minute. Together, they created a dense stream of armor-piercing and incendiary bullets. When a Corsair pilot pressed the trigger, the air itself seemed to tear open. Against the Zero, the results were devastating. Japanese fighters were built light, with thin skin and minimal internal protection. A short burst from the Corsair could cut through wings, sever control cables, and ignite fuel vapors almost instantly. Pilots often reported seeing Zeros burst into flame after only a second of fire. Unlike earlier American fighters with mixed armament, the Corsair's guns were standardized and reliable. Pilots could fire longer bursts without fear of jamming. They learned to wait until the perfect moment, close range, stable aim, then unleash controlled destruction. Veteran Corsair pilots described the sensation vividly. There was a brief shudder as the guns fired, then an explosion of fragments ahead. Sometimes there was no explosion at all, just a Zero suddenly losing a wing or folding in half. The fight ended before it truly began. Japanese pilots tried reinforcing certain aircraft, but shortages made widespread upgrades impossible. Even modified Zeros could not withstand sustained 50 caliber fire. The Corsair's bullets carried too much energy. Over time, Japanese pilots began recognizing the firing pattern. When they saw the distinctive flashes from a Corsair's wings, many knew the fight was already lost. What began as laughter, mocking an awkward-looking American plane, ended in silence, because the Corsair didn't need elegance. It needed only speed, discipline, and 6 guns that never hesitated. And those guns rewrote the air war in the Pacific. By mid-1945, the F4U Corsair had earned a reputation that few aircraft in history could claim.
What began as a machine mocked by Japanese pilots had transformed into a symbol of fear and eventual respect. The Japanese airmen who once laughed at its long nose and bent wings had learned a harsh lesson. This was no ordinary fighter. Reports from Japanese command were filled with warnings: avoid the Corsair, never engage alone, and always assume superior speed and firepower. The aircraft's sheer presence altered enemy behavior in the skies. Zeros that previously swooped aggressively now hesitated, often breaking off before the fight began. The laughter of 1943 had been replaced with caution, dread, and an acknowledgement of American engineering and tactics. For Corsair pilots, the transformation was equally profound. What started as trepidation, many early pilots feared crashing more than combat, had evolved into confidence. They flew missions with a clear understanding of their strengths: speed, firepower, durability, and tactical advantage. Marine and Navy pilots alike credited the Corsair with saving countless lives during escort missions, ground attacks, and intercepts against desperate Japanese pilots. Training played a key role in this respect. Pilots drilled endlessly, learning the aircraft's quirks, its torque on takeoff, its dive characteristics, and the timing of its guns. Discipline combined with raw engineering produced a fighter that could dominate any engagement without the pilot having to gamble on risky maneuvers. Stories of Corsair aces circulated quickly among Allied forces. Pilots like Gregory "Pappy" Boyington and Joe Foss became legends, not simply for their personal kills, but for demonstrating what a well-flown Corsair could do against the once dominant Zero. Each mission reinforced a growing pattern. The aircraft could fight smarter, strike faster, and survive longer than anything the Japanese could field. Even Japanese veterans admitted the shift. A surviving pilot reflected on the fear the Corsair inspired. It didn't matter how well we knew the skies. The moment we saw a Corsair above us, the fight was already lost. This respect, born from experience and repeated encounters, cemented the F4U Corsair's place in history as one of the most feared Allied fighters of World War II. The Corsair was no longer the Widowmaker. It was a sky predator, a machine that ended the mocking laughter and replaced it with reverence for friend and foe alike. By 1944, the Pacific War was reaching a pivotal stage. Japanese forces, once confident in their aerial superiority, were facing relentless pressure from American air power. Among the most significant contributors to this shift was the F4U Corsair, whose presence in the skies altered the dynamics of every engagement. The Corsair wasn't just a fighter, it was a strategic tool. Its speed, firepower, and durability allowed Allied forces to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, attack Japanese-held islands, and neutralize airfields before they could be used effectively. For the first time, Japanese pilots were reacting defensively, no longer choosing when and where to engage. Island-hopping campaigns showcased the Corsair's versatility. On Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Peleliu, Corsair squadrons provided both air cover and close air support. Its 650 caliber machine guns shredded enemy aircraft, while bombs and rockets tore through installations and supply lines. Each mission demonstrated that the air war was no longer evenly matched. The balance had tipped decisively. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was equally important. Once known for audacious dogfights and fearless attacks, they began approaching missions with caution or avoiding them entirely. Reports from Japanese commanders highlighted declining morale and hesitation among young pilots. The sight of a Corsair overhead often ended a sortie before it began. For American forces, confidence surged. Veteran Corsair pilots trained new recruits in proven tactics. maintain altitude advantage, dive with speed, engage carefully, and rely on disciplined fire from all 6 guns. These methods maximized kills while minimizing risk. Combined with superior coordination and radar guidance, Corsair squadrons became a cornerstone of Allied dominance in the Pacific. By mid-1945, the Corsair had become synonymous with Allied air supremacy. Japanese aircraft were scarce, and even the most experienced pilots knew that once the Corsair arrived, survival was unlikely. Air superiority allowed the Allies to focus on strategic bombings, naval operations, and preparing for the eventual invasion of Japan. The lesson was clear. The F4U Corsair had not only survived ridicule, it had transformed the war. The plane that Japanese pilots once laughed at now dictated the skies, ending the era of zero dominance and proving the lethal combination of innovation, firepower, and disciplined tactics.
By the final months of the Pacific War, the F4U Corsair had become more than just a fighter aircraft. It was a legend. Pilots who flew it were celebrated for their skill, courage, and ability to exploit the Corsair's deadly advantages against the Japanese Zero. These aviators were no longer mere soldiers. They were icons, shaping the narrative of aerial combat in the Pacific. Aces like Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, Joe Foss, and John "Johnny" Smith embodied the Corsair's lethal potential. Each had mastered its quirks, the torque, the long nose, the powerful engine, and combined them with rigorous tactics learned from months of combat. Their victories were not mere chance, they were the product of experience, discipline, and the unmatched capabilities of the Corsair itself. Accounts from Japanese pilots highlighted the psychological impact of facing these Corsair aces. Many reported that even seasoned aviators felt fear when they saw the blue wings approaching from high altitude. The combination of speed, maneuverability at altitude, and devastating firepower meant that once a Corsair was on a Zero's tail, escape was nearly impossible. Corsairs also became central to squadron cohesion. Pilots flew in disciplined formations, covering each other's blind spots while exploiting their superior energy and firepower. Their presence lifted morale across the fleet. Marine and Navy commanders increasingly relied on Corsairs for critical missions, from intercepting enemy raids to providing close air support for ground troops. The aircraft was trusted to perform where others might fail. Stories of individual heroism circulated widely. Pilots recounting engagements described chasing multiple Zeros in a single sortie, diving and climbing with precision, and taking down enemy planes that had once dominated the skies. These accounts, combined with verified kill ratios, contributed to a legend that would endure long after the war. By the end of the conflict, the Corsair was recognized as one of the deadliest piston-engine fighters ever built. Its raw firepower, speed, and pilot-centric design allowed Allied forces to claim air superiority and maintain it until Japan's surrender. In the process, both the aircraft and its pilots etched their names permanently into the annals of military aviation history.
The once feared Mitsubishi Zero, which had dominated the skies early in the Pacific War, was now a shadow of its former self. Its reputation as an unbeatable fighter had been shattered by the relentless efficiency of the F4U Corsair. What Japanese pilots had once laughed at, the plane's awkward appearance and nicknamed the Widowmaker, had transformed into a nightmare they could not escape. By 1944 to 1945, the Zero was outclassed in nearly every category. Its agility and turning speed no longer mattered when Corsair pilots refused to engage in traditional dogfights. Its lack of armor and vulnerable fuel tanks made it an easy target for 6 50-caliber guns that could shred the aircraft in seconds.
Japanese commanders were forced to change tactics, instructing pilots to avoid direct engagements entirely, an admission of defeat in the air. The psychological impact was devastating. Veteran Zero pilots began warning newcomers that the Corsair was a machine to be feared, not challenged. Entire missions were canceled or rerouted to avoid encounters with Corsair squadrons. What had once been a source of pride, the Zero's agility and long-range capabilities, was now irrelevant against the overwhelming speed, firepower, and durability of the Corsair. American pilots, meanwhile, capitalized on this dominance. They refined boom and zoom tactics, leveraging altitude, energy, and firepower to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk. The lessons learned in early campaigns against the Zero now became standard operating procedure, ensuring that the Corsair maintained its upper hand in virtually every engagement. By the time Allied forces approached Japan itself, the Zero was no longer the master of the skies. Its reign, which had seemed unassailable at the start of the war, ended in the face of superior technology, tactical innovation, and the bravery of the men who flew the Corsair. The laughter that greeted the Corsair in 1943 had been silenced forever. The F4U Corsair had not only survived the mockery, it had rewritten aerial combat in the Pacific. It had shattered the myth of the Zero, protected fleets, and secured air superiority for the Allies. In doing so, it became a defining weapon of World War II, a testament to the combination of engineering, strategy, and fearless piloting.
Even after World War II ended, the legend of the F4U Corsair endured. It was no longer just a tool of war. It became a symbol of innovation, resilience, and the transformation of air combat in the Pacific. Pilots who survived the war carried stories of its power, speed, and the way it changed the balance of aerial warfare. The Corsair's design, initially criticized for its quirks and labeled the Widowmaker, proved that engineering boldness combined with tactical mastery could produce an aircraft capable of dominating the skies. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns had shredded the once dominant Zero, rewriting the rules of air combat and forcing the Japanese Navy to adapt or perish. In post-war years, the Corsair continued to serve in conflicts like the Korean War, proving its durability and versatility. The lessons learned by Marine and Navy pilots during World War II, discipline, precision, and exploiting an aircraft's strengths, remained a model for future generations of fighter aviators. Veteran pilots often recalled the moment Japanese laughter gave way to fear. It was not just a victory in the air, it was a psychological triumph. The Corsair had shown that bravery alone was not enough. Superior technology and tactical understanding could decide the outcome of battles. Pilots who once feared the Zero now inspired fear themselves. Today, the Corsair is celebrated in museums, air shows, and history books. Its bent wings and long nose remain iconic, instantly recognizable symbols of the Pacific War. But beyond its physical design, the true legacy lies in the men who flew it and the tactics they perfected. Together, aircraft and pilot had done what many thought impossible. They ended the reign of the Zero and secured air superiority for the Allies. The story of the F4U Corsair is more than a tale of bullets and speed. It is a story of perseverance, adaptation, and mastery, of a machine that transformed mockery into legend, and a warplane that ensured the skies belonged to those who understood both its power and purpose. The laughter of the Japanese pilots in 1943 had long faded. By 1945, only respect remained,
and the enduring legacy of the Corsair was written in every victory it claimed.